The train screeched as it slowed beside a dusty wooden platform somewhere in the American West. It was early morning. Cold desert wind blew across the flat land, carrying the smell of hay and horses. Inside the train car sat dozens of German female prisoners of war. They had been traveling for days. None of them knew exactly where they were. One of them whispered quietly, "America?" Another shook her head. "This doesn't look like the America from the movies." When the doors opened, bright sunlight flooded the wagon. A group of American soldiers stood outside, wearing dusty boots and wide-brim hats. Behind them stretched miles of ranch land. Fences, barns, horses. One of the prisoners stepped down carefully. Her boots touched the dry ground. She looked around in confusion. "Where are the camps?" she asked in German. But there were no guard towers, no barbed wire walls around them, just open land. A tall American soldier looked at the women for a moment, then spoke quietly to another guard. "They look like they haven't eaten properly in weeks." The officer nodded. Many of the women were thin, exhausted, and pale from months of war shortages. One ranch worker nearby removed his hat and shook his head slowly. "Those girls aren't strong enough to work the fields." The prisoners stiffened. Work? They exchanged nervous glances. Back in Europe, stories about enemy camps had spread everywhere. Many expected harsh treatment. Instead, the Americans simply handed them blankets. And coffee. Hot coffee. The women stared at the cups in disbelief. One of them whispered quietly, "This must be a trick." The ranch foreman stepped forward. A tall man with sunburned skin, boots covered in dust, and the calm confidence of someone who had spent his entire life working cattle. He looked at the group carefully. Then he said something that confused everyone. "You're too thin to work." The prisoners froze. One woman slowly translated the sentence for the others. "Too thin to work?" They waited for the punishment that usually followed words like that, but instead, the cowboy turned to the cook beside the barn. "Get them breakfast." The prisoners exchanged stunned looks. None of them understood what was happening, and what the American cowboys did next would shock them even more.
Subscribe to the channel and don't miss new war documentaries.
The sun had barely climbed over the distant hills when the women were led toward the ranch buildings. Most of them had barely slept. The wooden barracks were simple but clean. There were blankets, real beds, not the hard wooden boards many of them had grown used to during the final months of the war. Outside, the sound of horses echoed across the ranch. One of the women slowly opened the door and stepped outside. The air smelled of dust, hay, and coffee. For a moment she simply stood there, staring at the endless land stretching far beyond the barns. Back home in Europe, land like this barely existed anymore. Everything had been destroyed, bombed, burned, or occupied. Here, it felt almost unreal. Behind her, several other prisoners stepped outside as well. They spoke quietly among themselves. "Do you think they will make us work today?" one asked. Another shrugged nervously. "They brought us here for something." Across the yard, several American cowboys were already working. They moved calmly between the horses and wagons, preparing tools and equipment for the day. Their movements were slow and confident, like people who had done the same work their entire lives. One of them glanced toward the women. He stopped. Then he said something quietly to the older ranch foreman beside him. The foreman looked at the group carefully. The women noticed the way the men were studying them, their thin arms, their tired faces, their worn coats. One of the younger prisoners suddenly lowered her head. She felt embarrassed. The war had taken everything from them: strength, pride, even dignity. Then the foreman walked toward them. The women stiffened. They expected orders. Instead, he spoke slowly, so one of the soldiers could translate. "You won't be working today." The translation spread through the group like a whisper. Not working? That made no sense. The foreman continued. "You're too thin. Some of you look like you'll collapse if we hand you a shovel." Several of the cowboys behind him nodded. One of them crossed his arms and said quietly, "They need food first." The women stared at them in silence. For months they had prepared themselves for the worst: harsh camps, punishment, hard labor. Instead, the Americans seemed concerned. A large ranch cook stepped out from the kitchen building. "Breakfast is ready." The smell hit them immediately. Fresh bread, eggs, hot potatoes. The women froze. One of them whispered in disbelief, "This must be for the soldiers." But the cook waved his hand. "All of you, come on." They slowly walked toward the long wooden tables outside the kitchen. None of them spoke. The first plate was placed in front of a young prisoner whose hands trembled slightly. Eggs, bread, butter. She stared at it, then looked up nervously. "Are we allowed to eat this?" The cowboy beside the table laughed quietly. "Lady, if you don't eat it, I will." That was the moment the tension finally broke. The women began eating, slowly at first, then faster. Some of them had tears in their eyes as they tasted real food again. Across the yard, the ranch foreman watched silently. One of the cowboys stepped beside him. "You think they'll be able to work after a few weeks?" The foreman nodded. "Maybe." Then he added quietly, "But that's not the real reason we brought them here." The cowboy frowned. "What do you mean?" The foreman looked back at the group of women sitting at the tables. "They've already fought enough war, and what the cowboys decided to do for them over the next weeks would completely change what those prisoners believed about their enemies."
Subscribe to the channel and don't miss new war documentaries.
By the third morning, the women had started to realize something strange about the ranch. No one shouted at them. No guards stood behind them with rifles. No one barked orders. The ranch simply woke up. And work began naturally. The sun rose slowly over the wide plains, painting the dusty ground with soft light. Horses moved lazily in their pens. Somewhere near the barn, a metal bucket clanged against a wooden post. One of the German prisoners, Anna, stepped outside the barracks and watched the ranch workers begin their day. Cowboys walked calmly across the yard, carrying ropes, saddles, and tools. They spoke quietly, sometimes laughing. The entire place felt normal, which made it even more confusing. Back in Europe, every prisoner camp had strict routines. Here, no one had explained anything. The women gathered near the doorway of the barracks, unsure what to do. "Are we supposed to work today?" one asked. "No one told us," another replied. Across the yard, a young cowboy noticed them standing there. He walked over slowly, adjusting his hat against the rising sun. "You ladies all right?" he asked. The translator repeated the words in German. Anna hesitated before answering. "We're waiting for orders." The cowboy looked puzzled. "Orders?" He glanced back at the foreman, who was fixing a wagon wheel nearby. The older man chuckled when he heard the translation. "Tell them this isn't the army." The translator passed along the message. The women exchanged uncertain looks. The foreman walked closer, wiping grease from his hands. "If you feel strong enough," he said calmly, "you can help around the ranch." He pointed toward several small tasks: feeding chickens, carrying water buckets, sorting potatoes in the kitchen. "Nothing heavy," he added, "but if you'd rather rest, that's fine too." The women stared at him. Rest? They had never heard that word in a camp before. Slowly, a few of them stepped forward. One woman helped the cook carry baskets of vegetables. Another followed a cowboy toward the chicken coop. Anna stayed behind for a moment. She watched the ranch yard carefully. Something inside her chest tightened. For years, the war had filled every day with fear. Now, suddenly, there was silence, freedom to move, freedom to choose. And that was when it happened. One of the younger prisoners suddenly stopped walking. Her hands began shaking. She covered her face. Then she started crying, not quietly, not politely, but the kind of crying that comes when months of fear finally break. Everyone froze. The women looked away, embarrassed. But one cowboy walked over slowly. He didn't say anything at first. Instead, he removed his hat and held it gently in his hands. Then he offered it to her. The translator spoke softly. He says, "You can sit for a while." The young woman looked up through tears. The cowboy simply pointed toward the wooden fence where the horses were standing. "Sit there," he said calmly. "No one's rushing you." The woman sat down slowly, holding the cowboy's hat in her hands. For the first time since the war began, she felt safe enough to cry. Across the yard, the ranch foreman watched the scene quietly. One of the soldiers beside him shook his head. "They expected us to treat them like enemies." The foreman nodded. "War does strange things to people." He looked back at the group of prisoners slowly beginning their small tasks around the ranch. "But sometimes," he added, "the best way to end a war is to stop acting like it's still happening." And over the next few days, something unexpected began to happen on that ranch. Something that none of the women, or the cowboys, had planned. But it would soon become the story everyone remembered.
Subscribe to the channel and don't miss new war documentaries.
By the end of the week, the ranch no longer felt like a place of captivity. The women still lived in the barracks, and soldiers were still present, but something about the atmosphere had changed. The constant tension they had carried for months slowly began to fade. Every morning the ranch woke up with the same quiet rhythm, the sound of boots on dry dirt, the creaking of barn doors, horses snorting softly in the early light, and now the women were part of that rhythm. Some helped the cook prepare vegetables for the ranch workers. Others carried small buckets of water or sorted grain in the storage barn. The cowboys kept their promise. Nothing heavy. Whenever someone looked tired, the foreman simply waved them away. "Go sit down," he would say. At first, the women felt uncomfortable with that. They had spent so long expecting punishment that kindness almost felt suspicious. But day after day passed, and nothing changed. No yelling, no threats, just work, meals, and quiet conversations. Then, one afternoon, something unusual happened. A group of the women had gathered near the horse corral. They were watching the cowboys saddle the animals. The horses were large, powerful creatures, far bigger than most of the women had ever seen up close. One of the prisoners whispered nervously, "In Germany, we used horses for farm carts, but not like this." Another nodded. "These animals look like they belong in a movie." A young cowboy overheard them. He leaned against the wooden fence and smiled. "You ladies ever ridden before?" The translator repeated the question. Most of the women shook their heads immediately. Anna hesitated. "Once," she said quietly, "when I was a child." The cowboy looked at the foreman across the yard. The older man raised an eyebrow. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" The cowboy grinned. A few minutes later, one of the calmest horses on the ranch was led to the fence. The women stepped back nervously. "It's all right," the cowboy said. "She's gentle." Anna looked unsure. "This is allowed?" she asked the translator. The foreman shrugged. "As long as nobody falls off." The cowboys helped Anna carefully climb onto the horse. For a moment, she froze. Her hands gripped the saddle. The horse shifted its weight slightly. Dust rose around its hooves. Everyone watched silently. Then the cowboy took the reins and began walking the horse slowly across the yard. Anna's eyes widened. She wasn't scared anymore. She was smiling. A real smile. The first many of the women had seen since they arrived. The other prisoners began laughing softly. Even some of the soldiers leaned against the fence to watch. The cowboy guiding the horse looked up at her and said something simple. "See?" The translator repeated the words. "You're not prisoners here today." Anna looked across the wide ranch land stretching toward the horizon. For a brief moment, she almost forgot there had ever been a war. Across the yard, the foreman watched quietly. One of the soldiers asked him, "You think this is a good idea?" The old rancher leaned on the fence. "Son," he said calmly, "sometimes people just need to remember what normal life feels like." But none of them knew yet. That one small horse ride would soon lead to something even more unexpected on the ranch. Something that would change how the women and the cowboys saw each other forever.
Subscribe to the channel and don't miss new war documentaries.
The ranch had changed in ways no one had expected. At first, the women had moved carefully, always watching the soldiers, always waiting for someone to remind them they were prisoners. But as the days passed, something quieter began to grow. Trust. It wasn't sudden. It happened in small moments. A cowboy leaving an extra loaf of bread on the kitchen table. The cook teaching one of the women how to make American cornbread. A soldier silently fixing a broken shoe for one of the prisoners. None of these things were dramatic, but together they slowly changed the atmosphere of the ranch. By the second week, the women had found their own small routines. Anna helped the cook almost every morning. Another woman, Marta, had become surprisingly good at feeding the chickens, and the younger prisoners often gathered near the horse corral just to watch the cowboys work. Sometimes the men even showed them small tricks: how to tie a rope, how to brush a horse, how to saddle properly. The ranch no longer felt like a place of waiting. It felt like a place where time moved slowly. One evening, as the sun began to sink behind the hills, the foreman walked across the yard toward the kitchen building. The cook was already preparing supper. Large pots steamed on the stove. The smell of roasted meat drifted through the open windows. Outside, the cowboys had set up long wooden tables near the barn. It was something they did every few weeks when the weather was good. A ranch supper. The prisoners watched from the barracks door. One of them whispered quietly, "Are they celebrating something?" Anna wasn't sure. Then the cook stepped outside and waved his hand. "Come help carry the food." The translator repeated the words. The women exchanged surprised glances. Help carry the food? That had never happened before. Soon they were moving between the kitchen and the tables, bringing out bowls, bread, and plates. The cowboys sat down along one side of the table. The soldiers took places nearby. But something unexpected happened next. The foreman looked at the empty benches on the other side. Then he nodded toward the women. "Sit." For a moment, no one moved. The translator repeated the words slowly. "Sit with them." The women froze. Prisoners didn't sit with guards. That simply didn't happen. Anna looked around nervously. "Are we allowed?" The foreman shrugged. "It's just supper." Slowly, the women took seats at the long wooden tables. At first, the silence was heavy. No one knew what to say. Then, one of the cowboys reached for the bread basket and passed it across the table. "Don't be shy," he said. A few quiet laughs broke the tension. Soon, the sound of conversation slowly filled the evening air. Plates moved across the table. People asked simple questions. Where someone came from, what farms looked like in Europe, what winters were like in America. It wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't politics. It was just people talking. Then, halfway through the meal, something unexpected happened. One of the younger prisoners suddenly stood up. Her voice trembled slightly. The translator listened carefully as she spoke in German. Then he looked at the table, unsure whether to translate. The foreman nodded. "Go ahead." The translator cleared his throat. "She says..." He hesitated. "She says she never imagined she would sit at the same table with the people she thought were her enemies." The table grew quiet. The young woman continued speaking. Her voice was calmer now. The translator spoke again. "She says..." This is the first evening since the war began that she feels like a normal person again. No one answered for a moment. Then the foreman leaned back in his chair. He looked down the long table filled with cowboys, soldiers, and prisoners. And he said something simple. "War ends, eventually." He paused. "But people still have to live in the same world afterward." The words stayed in the air long after the sun disappeared behind the hills. But none of them knew yet that the next morning would bring a moment on the ranch that no one would ever forget.
Subscribe to the channel and don't miss new war documentaries.
The ranch woke up earlier than usual that morning. The sky was still gray, and the cold desert air drifted slowly through the wooden buildings. Somewhere near the horse corral, a rooster crowed. Inside the kitchen, the ranch cook had already started the coffee, but something felt different. The radio was on. It sat on the corner of the wooden table. an old box radio that the ranch workers sometimes used to listen to news from the outside world. The cook stood beside it, arms crossed. 2 soldiers had entered the room quietly. None of them were speaking. Outside, the women began their morning routines. Anna was carrying a basket of eggs from the chicken coop when she noticed something unusual. The cowboys were gathering near the kitchen building. They weren't working. They were listening. A soldier stepped outside and called to the translator. "Bring them!" The translator walked across the yard toward the women. "You should come," he said. They followed him slowly. Inside the kitchen building, the radio crackled with static. Then a clear voice came through. The women couldn't understand the English broadcast, but they could see the faces of the soldiers and cowboys. Something had changed. One of the soldiers turned to the translator. "Tell them." The translator hesitated. Then he spoke quietly in German. "The war in Europe is over." For a moment, no one moved. The words hung in the room like something fragile. Over. The war was over. One of the younger women slowly covered her mouth. Another sat down in a chair without saying anything. Anna felt her legs weaken slightly. For years, the war had been the center of every thought, every fear, every day, and now, suddenly, it was gone. Outside the kitchen window, the ranch looked exactly the same. Horses in the corral, dust blowing across the yard, sunlight slowly rising over the hills. But everything felt different. The cowboys removed their hats quietly. No cheering, no celebration, just a long silence. Finally, the foreman spoke. "Well," he said calmly, "that's good news." One of the women looked at him. "Does that mean we leave?" The translator repeated the question. The foreman nodded slowly. "Eventually." The women looked at one another, leaving, returning to a world that no longer looked the same as the one they remembered. Then Anna stepped forward. She held something in her hands. The cowboy hat that had been given to the young prisoner during her first breakdown near the fence. She walked slowly toward the cowboy who had given it to her. The yard was completely quiet. She handed the hat back to him. But instead of letting go immediately, she said something softly in German. The translator listened. Then he smiled slightly before speaking. "She says..." He paused. "She thought she came here as a prisoner." The cowboy looked confused. The translator continued. "But she says she will leave remembering the ranch as the first place where the war stopped." No one spoke for a moment. The cowboy placed the hat back on his head. Then he nodded respectfully. "Take care of yourselves," he said. The women stood there quietly, looking at the barns, the horses, the dusty ranch yard where, for a short moment in the middle of a terrible war, enemies had simply become people again. Years later, some of those women would write letters about that ranch. They would describe the place where they expected cruelty, but instead found kindness. And one sentence appeared again and again in their memories. Not about soldiers, not about prisoners, but about the cowboys who looked at them and said something unexpected. "You're too thin to work." And sometimes, those simple words were the beginning of something far more powerful than war.